Hey everybody, welcome to the CB&Q and the CNW in Wyoming. Today is September 3rd, 2023. This is layout update number 46. I'm Mark Pruitt, Casper Division Traffic Manager. I did some intense work on the layout in August. I took your suggestions to heart and did most of the things that you guys all voted for. I did miss a couple of things. There just wasn't enough time in the month. But let me go through the entire tally. I'm going to look at the notes here to make sure I get this all right. Let's see. Item 1, Rocky Mountain Drilling, came in second place with 5 votes. Item 2, Rolling Stock Construction, didn't get any votes. Item 3, the Douglas Backdrop, also didn't get any votes. Item 4, which I forgot to write down, got 3 votes. Item 5, the Cody Branch Connection, 3 votes. Item 6, the Powder River Stock Pens, 2 votes. And item 7, the Wind River Canyon, is the winner at 7 votes. There was also an 8th item that was added by one of the operators here, Kevin from Harriman, Wyoming, made a note, and he said that it would be really helpful to replace the dummy coupler on the front of the Mikado that he ran the local out of Grable with. I guess he had a pretty difficult time on some of those switching moves. Let's take a look at each of these projects and see just what I did get done. Note of warning, this video is going to be a little bit longer. It was a really busy month. We'll start with Project 1, Rocky Mountain Drilling. The area started off looking like this. I decided that 2 houses against the backdrop just wasn't quite sufficient for the very pragmatic reason that the dirt road could be seen crashing into the backdrop. That didn't look very good. The obvious thing to do was to block the view of the end of the road. Another house, a duplicate of the white one already there, was the answer. I added some more low brush along the backdrop seam, planted a couple of rather scruffy looking trees, and plopped the house in place to get an idea of how the scene would look. I weathered this new house a bit heavier than the others to make it look a bit neglected. I put windows in the ends since they'll be visible from either the aisle or from a cab ride video, but I left the front doors and windows off since they'll never be seen. I put the weathered house back into the scene, added some grass tufts around the buildings and in the pipe yard, and added stacks of drill pipe. Getting better, but Rocky Mountain Drilling itself looks almost pristine. It was time to fix that too. First thing was to make signs for the building. For that, I used this old photo of the real building as a guide. I made a close copy of the sign in PowerPoint, and after a few tweaks, it was close enough. After gluing the signs to each end of the building and applying some weathering chalks, the pipe yard end of the building looks like this. I know this doesn't look a whole lot like the prototype structure did, but I didn't have a picture of the prototype structure before I built this kit. Maybe someday when everything else on the layout is done, I'll scratch build a better copy of the prototype and put it in place of this structure. Don't hold your breath. I love lighted structures, so my next step was to add lights to one of the houses. Rocky Mountain Drilling itself was already lit. I added an LED to the porch of the brown house and one to the room just inside. This is how the scene looks as shot with my cell phone camera in standard mode. Well, that doesn't look much like how you see it in person. The cell phone camera is actually pretty versatile. It has a mode where you can manually adjust many settings, including shutter speed, exposure value, and so on. After a bit of experimenting, I got this shot. It shows how much brighter the Rocky Mountain Drilling lights are compared to the house lights, and it also looks like a totally dead space sits between those 2 structures. The White House also needs a light or 2. So I added 2 LEDs to the White House. I just superglued 2 of the tiny LEDs to the wall of the house that faces the brown house. They should glow through the windows very nicely. Here I'm reinstalling the now lighted house. I used an awl to poke a decent sized hole in the foam base and feed the wires through. Reaching across the benchwork to do this while avoiding damaging anything else in the scene wasn't a piece of cake, but I got it done pretty easily. Then I eagerly turned off the room lights and lit up the buildings. Ouch! Those 2 LEDs in the White House glowed through the windows just fine. They also glowed right through the resin walls and the paint on the outside. This wasn't good. I was a bit surprised. Those walls are pretty thick. I took the house back out of the scene and painted the inside walls of the room with the LEDs dark gray. I put the house back the next day and lit everything up again. Much better. This is looking promising. Lights still aren't balanced real well though. Based on an editorial in the July Model Railroad Hobbyist, I ordered an inexpensive LED driver hub and cheapy wall wart power supply. For a bit over $20, I got a setup that can drive up to 50 LEDs from this one hub. I installed it under Rocky Mountain Drilling to power all the LEDs in the business and the houses nearby, and also maybe some of the lights in buildings yet to be installed in Douglas and this end of Casper Yard. Using resistors I had on hand to adjust the light intensity from the buildings, the final wiring into the hub looks like this. Additional connections will be made as I add other lighted buildings. I like this thing so much I've purchased 3 more. 2 will be used to power the icing platform, which by itself will have around 74 lights, and the other will be used elsewhere. I think I'll wind up with a couple dozen of these scattered around the layout someday. Here's more or less how the area looks with the light balanced. I did notice the brown house LEDs throw some light on the backdrop, but the eye tends to edit this out when you're looking at it in person, so I might just call it good and not try to add baffles to stop that. I wasn't done with the area yet though. The camera adjusts for light levels as needed, but in person the Rocky Mountain Drilling area is pretty dark, being stuck under the curve that leads into Hudson on the upper deck. I decided to add an under-counter light fixture to brighten the area. That meant drilling holes for wires and mounting hardware in the structure above, so I covered the entire area with a lightweight drop cloth and got to work. What with what was going on at Rocky Mountain Drilling and the work I was doing at Wind River Canyon, I made a real mess of the entire area. With installing the light above the area and the structure lights, I needed a way to control them without reaching across or under the layout. That meant power switches on the fascia. I added electrical boxes to the benchwork at the far west end of Douglas. Casper is just out of frame to the right. These will be powered by a cord plugged into a wall outlet near the boxes. A word of warning, I installed 120 volt power here. I've done simple house wiring before, so I know what I'm doing. But this stuff can burn your house down or even kill you if you don't do it right. So if you don't know exactly what you're doing, don't do it. Hire somebody. And with that said, this is how the switch station looks with everything complete. When the Douglas fascia is installed, the switches will be flush and the cover plates will fit on right over the fascia if I did it right. Tune in the future to find out. The switch on the right is the one for the overhead fixture and will be replaced with a dimmer when it shows up in the mail next week. It will ultimately control additional fixtures over West Douglas as well, which is under the shadow of Hudson above. The switch on the left controls power to a few outlets mounted under the benchwork that the wall warts for the structure lighting are plugged into. There will be several of these switch stations around the layout. Once the light was in, I tried it out. Looks like an intensely sunny summer day, doesn't it? In person, it's a bit too intense, which is why I need the dimmer. Before I took this shot, I added some grass along the road and in the ruts, and also more grass growing sporadically in the pipe yard and along the track. After I put the pipe stacks back in the yard and added barrels and crates inside the warehouse of Rocky Mountain Drilling, I took this shot. At this point, the area is pretty much complete except for additional clutter in the pipe yard. Here's a rider's view clip of a car being delivered to Rocky Mountain Drilling. And that's it for this project. On to project 2, rolling stock. Nobody actually voted for this one, but preparing cars to be added to the layout is a great filler between other projects, and I certainly need the cars on the layout, so I added 9 additional cars this month. There are 7 revenue cars and 2 way cars. There's a bunch of other stuff as well. The first car is this stock car, which I heavily weathered. I posted a video on August 7th about how I weather stock cars. One observant commenter pointed out that this particular line of stock cars carries the Chinese red paint scheme, which is 15 years and maybe more after my era. But for now they serve the purpose, and other than the paint scheme, they match my era well enough. I picked a set of 6 of these up already built at a train show a few years ago. I also have the full line of unbuilt kits as well. I'll repaint those before adding them to the roster. Bill, one of the members of the Sheridan, Wyoming Model Railroad Club, came down to the Casper Club in the middle of August and brought along a whole bunch of equipment. He was thinning out his collection, and as luck would have it, I was there to help him out. Part of that collection included 2 way cars he lettered for the Wyoming and Northwestern, the CNW-controlled railroad that built the line from Casper to Lander. That line was subsumed into the Chicago and Northwestern in 1920, but it's quite possible that a few pieces of rolling stock out here on the far end of the cowboy line survived in their original paint schemes into my era. These way cars are a great nod to the early days of the Lander line. Also part of that collection is this Wyoming and Northwestern boxcar. This is an AccuRail kit that Bill relettered. Then we have this FGE reefer. I think this was built from an old Athearn kit. It was given to me along with a few other cars by Dave in Basin. Next is this PFE reefer, also a gift from Dave. Back to that collection I got from Bill. This boxcar was built from a LaBelle kit. It's lettered for the Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Valley Railroad, the company that built many of the CNW lines in Nebraska, including the line to the Wyoming state line in 1899. No longer suited for interchange service, this car will be found trundling sadly along between Casper and Lander. Another new addition is this Spokane International boxcar. This is another AccuRail kit. The last freight car I got onto the tracks this month is this red top evaporated milk reefer. This, along with 13 other pieces of rolling stock, mostly reefers, which I have yet to get on the layout, was a gift from another Dave. This Dave lives in Ontario, Canada, and is a contributor to the channel. You'll be seeing more of the cars he gave me appearing on the layout over the next few months. The unexpected generosity of both Dave in Basin and Dave in Ontario has gone a long way towards easing my reefer shortage. My heartfelt thanks to both of them. And that's it for freight cars, but we're not done with rolling stock yet. In that huge trove of equipment I got from Bill was a bunch of the Walthers Heavyweights CB&Q passenger cars. When these first came out about 20 or so years ago, I knew right then I should have bought at least one set. But I didn't, and I've been kicking myself ever since. I've managed to obtain a couple of them off eBay, but when they show up there, they usually go for much more than I'm willing to pay. I've been watching for them at train shows, but to this point hadn't seen any. Bill had all these, and I took every single one off his hands. I just pulled these beauties out of the boxes and placed them on the tracks, something I almost never do. I'll pull them back off and paint the wheels and trucks and lightly weather the cars over the next month or two, but for now, they're sitting happily in Casper Yard. If you don't want me to spend so much time talking about rolling stock additions to the layout in the future, let me know in the comments. I'll adjust accordingly. Next up is Project 3, the Douglas Backdrop. This is the other project nobody voted for, but this one was necessary to complete to allow me to build Douglas, so it was a bit of a priority this month. I had the backdrop printed in late July. It was sitting all rolled up in the bag, just waiting for its turn in the sun. Dave from Basin was coming down for a visit in the middle of August, and he agreed to help me install the Douglas backdrop. This is definitely a two-person job. I prepared for his visit by trimming the sky off the backdrop sheets. On the 17th, Dave and his wife came for their visit. While Dave's and my wives were shopping, Dave and I made short work of mounting the backdrop on the Douglas skyboard. We coated the back of the backdrop with wallpaper paste and stuck it up. Track height will be right at the bottom of the backdrop. All in all, it came out pretty good. During the afternoon, Dave helped me with the Wind River Canyon, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. Next up is Project 4, West Staging. This project got 3 votes, but I didn't do anything at all to the west staging itself. Because of how it would restrict access to the Douglas backdrop in the corner and to the Rocky Mountain drilling area, those things had to be done first, and after they were finished, I was out of time for the month. But I'll have to get west staging extended before I can begin pushing track eastwards out of Casper to Douglas, so it's the #1 priority for this month. Project 5, the connection to the Cody branch. This one was pretty easy. It took all of about an hour. I did it the last day of August. I still need to wire it up so that opening the swing gate, which is just out of frame to the right, will cut power to this track. Like west staging, that will be done early this month. Now comes Project 6, the stock pens at Powder River. I just didn't have time to work on this one much at all. The other projects took too much time. I did do one thing though. I bought the tile grout that I'll be using for dirt in the pens. Hopefully it won't go bad before I get time to use it. It only has a shelf life of 10 or 15 years. Finally, we get to the biggest project, Project 7, and the winner with 7 votes, the Wind River Canyon. It was time to begin extending the canyon on around the free end of the peninsula. The last time I did any real work on the canyon was in June of last year. A general shot of the south end looked like this. The north end, the free end of the peninsula, looked like this, and here it stayed until August of this year. I planned for some pretty tall fascia at the end of the peninsula to hide the turnback curves for both the Burlington line on the bottom and the C&W line above it. The tunnel on my Burlington line will represent this tunnel on the prototype. Here's a view of the whole rock outcropping the tunnel penetrates. This is called Pink Tunnel by train crews because of the color of the rocks at the portals. The entire tunnel is actually only a few cars long. Because of the need to hide the C&W line right above the Burlington line, my version of the Pink Tunnel will be quite a bit longer than the real thing. I guess you could call this selective expansion. That's pretty rare on a model railroad. The mountain will build up above the fascia, so the first order of business was to install some supports for the pink foam. Here I've installed some of those supports and laid foam on top to see how everything would fit. The next step was to figure out where the ends of the 8-foot long masonite fascia would land. To do that, I had to install fascia all the way from the south end of the canyon to about where the tall sections would start. The higher section in the distance in this shot is where I plan to model the section of canyon wall with the highway on the opposite side of the Wind River from the railroad. The fascia pieces closer to the camera are way too tall and will be trimmed down to final height in the future. With the fascia end locations now established, it was time to start adding support for the tall sections of masonite around the end of the peninsula. Those wimpy little 1x2s that support the foam weren't going to do it. To support the heavy masonite, I installed a series of well-braced 2x4s around the edge of the benchwork. Those would be beefy enough to hold the fascia solidly in place. There would be some modifications required, but overall it worked well. After Dave and I finished with the Douglas backdrop on the 17th, we turned our attention to the fascia for the rest of the day. One thing we discovered right away was that we had no hope of bending the masonite around the corner in the foreground of this shot. An adjustment was needed. We spent about an hour modifying the corner so that it was beveled rather than a hard, nearly 90-degree transition. That allowed space for the masonite to curve properly. But that also brought up another problem. The joist just behind the first one in the foreground was no longer securely held vertically. That was easily solved by adding a short section of L-girder to the joist spanning this area. Once again, I'm glad I didn't discard all those L-girders I brought from the New Jersey version of the layout. Unfortunately, the afternoon was passing by, and Dave and his wife had to leave for home, a 3.5-hour drive, before we could mount the masonite on the layout. I had to do that by myself a few days later. Over the next couple of days, I did some more modifications to the supporting structure, and on the 20th, I was ready to finally install the fascia. After cutting it to a slightly taller height than it would be when finished, I began installing it. Here I've got the first piece on the left partially installed and am adding the second piece. The free end on the right is temporarily resting on the Douglas benchwork. Here we're looking at it from the other side. That vertical plywood strip near the center of this photo is the splice plate between the masonite sections. It's not attached to the benchwork, allowing it to float sideways to ensure a smooth curve of the fascia. Here I've got the second piece clamped into its final location. At this point, I was able to spot places I would need additional supports. I unwrapped the second sheet again and began upgrading some of the supports. Here near the center you can see where I removed one of the 1x2 foam supports. Its brace is hanging out in thin air. It had become obvious that a wider width than the 3/4 inches of some of the 1x2 supports would be needed to secure the fascia, so I replaced a couple of the 1x2s with 2x2s or 2x4s, whatever I had on hand. By late in the day on the 20th, I had the supports upgraded and the entire fascia fully installed, I thought. As it turned out, I would need to remove parts of it a couple days later to add more foam supports, but that wasn't at all difficult. They came off and went back on with very little effort. On the 23rd, I started adding more foam to the canyon walls. I had a full sheet and one more half sheet of pink foam in the garage, plus a few smaller chunks from earlier work, and I used them all. Here I've added the first few new chunks of foam over the C&W line, tying it into the fascia. I cut the edge of the foam chunks that butt against the fascia roughly to the curve of the fascia where they met. Any small gaps will be filled in later. Foam was added as before, using low-temperature hot glue. The work went quickly. I added only a few foam chunks at the end of the peninsula, then went further down the canyon to rough out the missing tunnel, tunnel number 3. Then it was back to the end to rough in the substructure above the portal of pink tunnel. At this point, it was a matter of simply cutting foam to size and gluing it in place. Other than the wide pieces to cover the C&W track and support the pieces to come above them, most of the foam was cut to about 3 inches wide and 1 to 3 feet long and just glued in a staggered pattern, one above the next. I worked my way along the canyon, extending the height and length of the foam supports as I went. The basic landform of the mountains took shape until I reached the point where I could go no farther. This is where I'm at now. I ran out of usable foam at this point, but more importantly, I can't continue on until I've prepped the south end of Thermopolis for the end of the canyon. This will include installation of a turntable just outside the mouth of the canyon so that locals can turn their engines for the return trip to Grable. Here's how things look from the south end of the canyon at this time. While the foam isn't complete all the way to Thermopolis, there's plenty of work to do shaping the foam that's installed and adding plaster cloth and plaster. I'm hoping to get a start on that in September. In the July update video, I mentioned that I have a motive power shortage. Well, I still do, but I did pick up this little spectrum consolidation at the train show in Evanston in early August. This will help a lot on the C&W line. Another thing I can do to temporarily ease the shortage is use these NP malleys for the through freight drags across the layout. I bought these years ago when I was going to be modeling part of the NP line. These locomotives never ran through the Casper division, but they'll work just fine until I can obtain more proper Burlington power to take their place. For passenger power, I can use my 2 brass GN locomotives, this H6 Pacific, and my favorite loco of all time, the P2 Mountain. I'll need to add decoders to both of these, which I might not get to by the next operating session in October, but at some point they'll be on the line. That's where we are as of September 3rd, 2023. During this month, I'll add the curve under Casper to west staging and wire the Cody branch connection I installed a few days ago into the swing gate power cutoff switch. After those are done, I'm going to start adding the sub-road bed and track for Douglas. That's my main priority for September, since I'd like to have the track completed from Casper to Orrin by the October operating session. I want to trim the newly installed fascia in the canyon and start shaping the pink foam and maybe add some more plaster cloth. On top of all that, I'd like to at least get a start on adding ground to the Powder River stock pins. During the odd extra hours, there's also a lot more rolling stock to get added to the layout. Anybody want to make any bets on how much of that I actually managed to do? One more time, I want to thank the folks who sent me some rolling stock. I also want to thank those who offered, but whom I didn't take up on at this time. It's very much appreciated. Thanks for watching, everyone. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you next month.